Hello, and welcome to a book report, Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. So, I guess background as to why I'm putting this video together is in reading the book, Tragedy and Hope, which if you're familiar with it, you understand the size and scope of it. It's immense and daunting and takes time and concentration. And so as I was reading it, I was marking passages I found interesting. And as I finished the book, I decided to compile those interesting passages into a spreadsheet where I could sort and categorize and order and analyze and do further research upon. So that's what inspired me to put together this video. And I think there's going to be a few more based on the different categories of information I've sorted in my spreadsheet based on the book. This video, however, is an introduction and a description of the core message of Tragedy and Hope. Okay, Tragedy and Hope is a very big book that has a lot of information in it. But when you look at 5–10% of it, you come away with a lot. It reveals the facade of the left-right paradigm. It reveals the facade of the Republicans versus the Democrats, the political system that's in play in the United States today, the left-right, probably in play in most of the countries around the globe. It's a facade, right? These people are owned, and so the real problem, or the people behind the scenes, what I would point out would be like the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, or what Carol Quigley, the author of Tragedy and Hope, calls the Anglo-American establishment. Okay? Think of them as central bankers, international and multinational corporation stakeholders, um, countries and sovereign governments are an impediment to people that operate in that fashion. And so that's where you get the globalist versus the nationalist theme that's very popular right now, as a matter of fact, in 2018. The globalist mindset of the central bankers and the multinational corporations, as pointed out by Quigley in the book, are really the owners or the ones that manipulate the left and the right, or the Republicans and the Democrats in the case of the United States. And so as the masses, the not the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, but the rest of them, the people, fight between each other, left versus right, the central bankers, the Anglo-American establishment, the 1% of the 1% of the 1% continue to own more and take more, tax more, and squeeze more out of us. The book I used is the third printing, 1998, from GSG and Associates Publishers. A little background on Quigley, the book, and some other nuggets. Quigley was born in 1910 and died in 1977, and was an American historian and professor at Georgetown University. My edition has a quote about Quigley from Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton considered Quigley a mentor. And if you know anything about Bill Clinton, that ought to tell you a lot about where we're going with this video and the message that Quigley's trying to project, the core message. Okay? Back to the book though. It was first published in 1966 by the Macmillan Company. The publisher told Quigley that the plates were destroyed. So this was after some publications, some form of publication, some number of copies getting out, right? However, the publication company considered the book out of stock. So if you tried to order it, it would just say out of stock. We'll get to you later. However, if the publisher told the author the plates were destroyed, they were never going to republish it at all. This put the book in a limbo and prevented the publishing rights to return to Quigley. Quigley himself is quoted as saying, "Powerful influences in this country want my work suppressed." Now, Quigley himself later on in the book mentions that the deeds that this Anglo-American establishment are undertaking are commendable. That's his quote, commendable. and he doesn't see why it should be a secret. It should be out in the open what they're doing. However, I suggest probably the bulk of the folks that are in the Anglo-American establishment did not agree with that sentiment, and therefore Quigley's work was suppressed as best as it could be. A couple of things to note. There's a gentleman out there named Joe Plummer. He wrote a small book called Tragedy and Hope 101. I mentioned that there's a percentage of the book that's really pertinent to the core message that we're covering. There's a lot of other history and politics and whatnot, the background, context, etc. Skip that all, pull that all out, and you can find that Joe Plummer's book Tragedy and Hope 101 really nails it. And Joe Plummer also read Quigley's other works, so he skims across the context of Quigley's books as a whole and is able to weave them together and put together a nice message. You can find that online as a free ebook, or you can actually pick up a couple copies and give to friends and family members. Yeah, you'll find Tragedy and Hope if you start looking around, referenced in other books. Cleon Skousen's an example. There's tons of YouTube videos and interviews of Quigley himself. Do the research, please. Okay. The book itself, the introduction, is broken down into 4 sections. The first, the preface, and Quigley puts a little disclaimer in there as far as to how he's trying to cover such an immense topic and yet keep it in the scope of one single book. And what he does with the covering of human history in 271 pages is, quote, use perspective not only by projecting the patterns of past history into the present and the future, but also by trying to place the events of the present in their total context by examining all the varied aspects of these events, not merely the political and economic, but also the military, technological, social, and intellectual. Like I said, it's a vast subject. The last 3 topics that he covers in the introduction are cultural evolution in civilizations, cultural diffusion in civilizations, and then Europe's shift to the 20th century. Okay, cultural evolution in civilizations is summarized by Quigley in the sense that mankind generally will live in separate organized societies with distinct cultures, and pre-technological, let's say 19th, 20th century, 21st century, you had geographical distance making it difficult for groups to maybe share uh, ideas. So think of it globally, a group of cultures that live in, let's say, Central Africa in a dense forest versus a group of civilizations or cultures that live in the Andes in South America versus on the coast in Asia versus in a densely packed urban development in Western Europe. And you begin to get the idea that these groups of people were going to develop at different levels and different advance at different levels and pick up different things at different times and maybe not even um, so for example like the wheel or certain forms of writing or types of culture as far as agriculture. And so however, the civilizations are going to pass through a common pattern of experience regardless of the distinct characteristics that make up those cultures. So again, looking at our groups around the world, they might have different levels of writing or art or agriculture, but they're probably going to pass through a very similar pattern of experience where they're born, they'll go through a period of expansion, have a crisis of organization, then they'll reorganize, generally in a weaker state. There'll be a period of stability, stagnation, potentially. That should yield a golden age of peace and prosperity. Another crisis occurs, uh, right? Just like 5, 6, and 7 will repeat over and over and over until civilization succumbs to outside forces. Quigley is keen to point out that the outcomes are not vital for the civilization's future, but rather the reorganization process is what's critical to allow the process for normal growth. So governments might change from completely liberal democracy to totalitarian, whether that's realistic or not, bear with me, but that type of government might change in one of these crisis of organizations. And as long as the processes that carry over into the new system flow uh, adequately, I suppose, and allow for normal growth, then this process should repeat. And so I think that's what where Quigley's talking about. It's not necessarily the outcomes of each step that's vital. It's the organization process that allows for normal growth to continue in the next stage. Okay, and so then Quigley goes into a description of Western civilization as far as cultural evolution. He talks about the first expansion being from 970 to 1270. And I'm not going to get into the details, and this is not a history lesson. This is more of a summary of the book, Tragedy and Hope. So if you need more information on this, you're more than welcome to go do the research. But that first expansion then led to a conflict from 1270 to 1440, and the core empire would be England, peaking about 1420. That led to a second expansion from 1440 to 1690, where then we had a second conflict from 1690 to 1815. Core empire at that point being France, peaking about 1810. Okay, the third expansion of Western civilization, Quigley uh, documents, is 1770 to 1929. And that conflict, that third conflict of Western civilization, was from 1893. And he leaves it open. Again, this was written published in 1966, and the core empire being Germany, peaking about 1942. And so he leaves it open-ended because he sees two future possibilities: the fourth expansion starting in 1944 and moving onward, or a continuation of the process with USA being the universal empire. Didn't forecast a peak date, but you know, he's not a fortune teller, and he's only laying out the pattern, which would then go into a decay, and of course then the invasion and an end of civilization. So he's seeing a pattern repeating with an expansion or potentially the end of the civilization. And he's talking about Western civilization here. Okay, moving on to cultural diffusion. Different than the evolution. This is the second topic in the introduction, diffusion. And by diffusion, he means the Western civilization diffusion outwards into other civilizations. And so examples would be Christianity, weapons, medicine. And Quigley goes through a couple of examples in North America. So looking at Plains Indian tribes who had been impoverished prior to 1543, they achieved a higher standard of living when the Spaniards brought horses into Mexico, and those diffused up northward through the civilizations and the cultures. And conversely, Trans-Appalachian Indian tribes, which were strong at the time, but however got introduced to whiskey and weapons and measles, were soon decimated. So the diffusion of Western civilization had a plus to some and a negative to some tribes and cultures and civilizations it came into contact with. Quigley then talks about how the classical civilization was born from the wreckage of Cretan civilization. Again, going back to our patterns and the wreckage of civilizations and the birth of new ones. So from about 1150 BC to 900 BC. And then using that to piggyback onto how Western civilization was born from the wreckage of classical civilization between around AD 350 and 700. Okay. Couple points Quigley mentions about cultural diffusion. Quote, "It is possible that new civilizations may be born in the debris from the civilizations wrecked by Western civilization on the fringes of Asia." Again, keep in mind, published in 1966. Vietnam had just barely blipped. Korea was going on. China and Japan were in different states where they are now in 2018. Okay. But the wreckage Quigley refers to here are Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, and Japanese civilizations. Again, not a fortune teller, just trying to forecast. Quote, "It would appear at the present time that new civilizations may be in the throes of birth in Japan, possibly in China, less likely in India, and dubiously in Turkey or Indonesia." So Quigley goes on to mention that he believes that one of those that he mentioned up above in the quote, as a powerful new civilization, would act as a counter to the Soviet Union in Eurasia. Interesting, right? Okay, looking at the demographic cycle, Quigley mentions there's 4 stages, and looking at the 4 metrics of those stages, where you look at stage A up to stage D, you can see stage A is a growing, youthful, stable organization, culture, whereas the D stage, dying. And then, of course, B and C is somewhere in between. I'm not going to get into the specifics. You can pause and look if you need to see more. But note then that Quigley goes on to look at between the Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe civilizations compared to Asia and specific dates where the stages of the demographic cycle have occurred. And you can see that line that he's drawn between the Bs from 1850 from Western Europe between 1950 and 2000 to Asia represents the greatest population pressure, right? The demographic explosion of the type B population. So thinking of it as peaking, where you can see in 2000, he's got Western Europe into a dying stage, Central Europe into a dying stage, Eastern Europe's on its way to a D or a dying stage, and Asia's right there, peak. Okay, so again, looking at the previous information in more informational format, Quigley describes how at an interval of approximately 50 years, there's a sequence of 4 successive population pressures. That's that B line that we saw in the previous slide. So there's an Anglo-French pressure about 1850, then it goes into a Germanic-Italian pressure about 1900, then a Slavic pressure about 1950, and forecasting an Asiatic pressure about 2000. Quigley at this point expresses, quote, the danger to both Western civilization and Soviet civilization from Asiatic pressure by 2000. Interesting, right? I'm doing this video in 2018. Okay, looking at the developments in Western Europe versus the developments in Asia as far as uh, certain categories or revolutions or advances technologically, Quigley breaks down on the left Western Europe and on the right Asia. And you'll see why this is critical and important in the next few slides. But think of it this way. Western Europe developed Western ideology first. And just real quick, below the punchline, flip over to the developments in Asia side, and you'll see number 7, and last, if at all, Western ideology. Again, published in 1966. Think about in 2018. Has Asia developed Western ideology, Western civilization, as far as their ideology? You can probably point to certain places, but as a whole, I'll leave it to you to come up with your own answer. But going again back over to the other side, Western ideology was developed first, then you saw a revolution in weapons, then an agricultural revolution, then an industrial revolution, then the revolution in sanitation and medicine, which yielded a demographic explosion, and then the revolution in transportation and communications. This occurred differently order-wise with Asia. So you can see on the other side, it's not close to the same. And this is going to be important because in 1830, democracy was growing in the West. The development of weapons had reached a point where both the government and the private citizens were pretty much equally matched. So the agricultural revolution raised the standard of living. Folks could afford good weapons, just as nice as what the government had in some cases. Okay, the industrial revolution meant that you could mass produce weapons. They were cheaper. They were accessible. You could put them on trains and ship them. So again, private citizens had access to pretty powerful weapons compared to the government. Fast forward 100 years to 1930, and then even more by 1950, the development of the weapons technologically advanced to the point where the governments could obtain way more powerful weapons than private citizens. They were much more powerful. Okay, so in Asia, the technological advance of weapons occurred prior to private citizens having the success like Western civilization did due to agricultural or industrial revolutions. So the governments took advantage of being able to mass produce the weapons and the technological advances, whereas the folks, not so much. Additionally, in Asia, the sanitation and medical revolution occurred prior to the agricultural revolution and affected, because of the timing again, affected the standards of living. And so Western civilization was able to just explode because of the order and the timing. Asia had difficulties because of the Asian and timing. Okay, so that's how Quigley points out the criticality of the order of the previous slide and why within just 100 years the governments and of course today openly oppress their people, whereas in 1830 they wouldn't dare oppress citizens. Citizens could actively engage in uprisings and revolutions and stand against them weapon-wise. But a mere 100 years later, 120 years later, private citizens can do little to prevent oppression because of the technological advances of the government's weapons. So for those of you who are non-US citizens, this is the criticality of the Second Amendment from a little sidebar here. This is the criticality of the Second Amendment. We do not need the governments to hold all the weapons. So the private citizens should have every technological advance they can cling onto within the Second Amendment. Amen. Okay. Quigley then goes on to mention that Western civilization is based on democratic principles in science, whereas Asiatic countries have traditionally been based on authoritarian political traditions. So therefore, Quigley asserts that, quote, democracy had a hopeful future in Europe in 1830 and a dubious future in Asia in 1950. And he even mentions very dubious in 1950. Again, published in 1966. Think about the turn of events since he published the book. The last section of the introduction is Europe's shift to the 20th century. Quigley goes on to summarize the 19th century is marked by belief in the innate goodness of man, secularism, belief in progress, liberalism, capitalism, faith in science, democracy, nationalism. Fast forward to today, and you can probably, if you think and research hard enough, find where just about every single one of those is under attack, even in the Western civilization and even in the United States. So think how far we've come. Progress? Okay, so the core message is what I'm going to get at with the rest of the end of this video. The core message as I pull it out of the book. Again, this is my book report. So I'm going to cover the core message or the ultimate goal as I see it, as described by Quigley. I'm going to look at some of the processes that the book Tragedy and Hope documents that will be used to achieve the ultimate goal. And then, although not explicitly mentioned, but pretty accurately portrayed, we're going to go through some examples of technocracy that Quigley has in the book. Some of the other uh, videos I hope to put together will be lessons from Quigley, the Tragedy and Hope lessons, some economic lessons, some history lessons, and there'll be some biographies associated with those. I also have a number of notes on the military-industrial complex. Obviously, that's a huge part of where we're going with this, but that's going to be addressed separately and very superficially in the core message. So we'll cover the history of the military-industrial complex and some of the key biographies. We'll talk about propaganda, and we'll look at some historical examples of propaganda, and again, some of the key biographies. I've got some money quotes. They don't really need much more explaining than just reading and looking at them. They're self-explanatory, they tell you everything, and they're pretty damning. We'll look at some biographies associated with those as well. Okay? So I've summarized the introduction, and I'm at this point going to go through some core message points. And I've again broken the book up into notes. And so in chapter 4, starting page 131, there's a gentleman that Quigley mentions named Cecil Rhodes. And if you're not familiar with Cecil Rhodes, you need to do a bunch of research on that man. I'm going to talk about him a little bit, but again, this is not a history lesson. This is a summary of the book. This pulls out some of the key nuggets of the Tragedy and Hope Quigley book, so that you get a good idea um, of what Quigley's trying to demonstrate. Right. So at this point, chapter 4, page 131, Quigley goes, Cecil Rhodes and his, quote, purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. Wow, right? Who's this guy and what does he think he is and how's he going to get away with this? Well, Cecil Rhodes was at Oxford and was influenced by a man named John Ruskin, according to Quigley. Here's another one to go look up. But Ruskin's inaugural lecture was basically earth-shattering to Rhodes, and he copied it longhand, and it became his mantra. And if you look at what that quote says, it's basically what Ruskin was talking about, the desire to federate the English-speaking peoples of the world under their control. And so Rhodes gets out of Oxford and goes on into South Africa and begins exploiting the gold and diamond fields. Becomes Prime Minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896, and is very, very influential in politics and seats in both England and South Africa. At some point, he sought to join South Africa and Egypt with a strip of British territory, including telegraph and railway. Again, late 1800s, East Coast Africa might as well belong to the English-speaking Western civilization, UK-based folks, right? And so that was his goal. He obtained financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bate, two other names you probably need to do some research on, the former being primary to your research. But he used that financial support in order to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as the De Beers Consolidated Mines. Has anyone heard that name before? De Beers Mines of diamond mines? Yeah, it all goes back and ties together. So Cecil Rhodes by the mid 1890s had an income of £1 million sterling, or approximately $5 million. And he spent so freely that he was usually overdrawn on his account. Now, how does Quigley know this? I can't prove it, but he says he had access to papers of the Anglo-American establishment. So I think that Quigley said he spent a lot of the 50s researching, maybe even starting in the 40s, researching the papers and documentation from a lot of the Anglo-American establishment in order to put together this book. And so I'm presuming that he had access to, if not Cecil Rhodes' papers, to some sort of documentation that would allow him to, quote, say he was usually overdrawn on his account, which means he spent a lot of money every year. And what was he spending it on? Lastly, part of Rhodes' fortune was left to found the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin envisioned, tying back to Ruskin at the beginning. Interesting, right? Chapter 7, page 324, quote, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, to create a world system of financial control in private hands. So looking at that a little further, Quigley talks about in 1919, the bankers and the politicians attempted to restore the commercial organization and financial practices to pre-war 1914 system. Again, thinking about how the patterns of civilization occur and they grow and break, the system, commercial organization and financial practices pre-World War I were they were broken. So the bankers and politicians in 1919 had tried to reestablish that system. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert using secret agreements established during frequent private meetings and conferences. If you pay any attention to what's going on with anything in the central banks and the global internationals and the the agreements, right? The NAFTAs and the TTPs and the TTIPs and the loss of sovereignty, then it doesn't sound very different in 2018 than it did back in 1918, 1919, right? Right. The apex of the system was the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Do some research on the BIS. Look how that was founded. Look what that does. Yeah. The BIS is a privately owned bank controlled by the world's central banks, quote, which were themselves private corporations. I do not have the time to go into the detail behind that, but that nugget right there is immense. And if you do anything, go out and do that research. Private corporations, central banks. So say, is the Federal Reserve any more government than Federal Express? No. Okay? So each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. So unpack that. Look at what's going on today. Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates. Trump's yelling at him. What are you doing? You're slowing down the economy. Hmm. I don't know. Are there any cooperative politicians getting economic rewards in the business world? I can't say, but it's pretty clear that at the time that Quigley wrote this, and at the time when the central banks were born, is no different than the time today, and that there's the control influenced by the private central banks across governments and politicians and influences economies and the markets. And some people are rewarded and they advance the cause of the private central bankers, and some people are not, and they probably are destroyed. Just saying. Okay? Central bankers mentioned by Quigley include Montague Norman, the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and Charles Rist, the Bank of France, and Halmer-Schecht of the Reichsbank. Four more names you can do some research on. On chapter 16, I'm sorry, on page 836 of chapter 16, Quigley brings up a gentleman named Charles P. Snow. Does anyone know who he is? Let's find out, because he covers the beginnings of what I see as technocracy. Not defined, but clearly based on what he demonstrates is technocracy. And if you don't know the definition of that, pause the video, go look it up, find out, because that's what we're talking about here. Scientists will play a vital role in secret decisions that determine whether we live or die. I don't think I like that. I don't know about you. Okay. When Quigley's discussing this particular section, he talks about rationalization, rationalism, and science. Again, do not have the time to go into those. If you want, do the research. You'll learn quite a bit about where the 18th and 19th century changes occurred and what they all mean. But basically, rationalization and science are different from rationalism because they're more empirical, they use sense observations, they're more practical because they want to get things done in a temporal world rather than trying to discover a nature of ultimate truth. That's rationalism. Both rationalization and science have played significant roles in Western civilization, according to Quigley, and it's even a basic reason why the West beat fascism and totalitarianism, according to Quigley. The interesting point here is he says, however, they have been almost peripheral to the experience of ordinary men. So the people that are making the decisions as far as how the West beats fascism and totalitarianism are using rationalization and science, but your average Joe is not. So Quigley goes on to say, quote, and this is my bold, they almost certainly must become matters of first-hand experience for the majority of men if Western civilization is to survive. Quote, as the novelist of these matters, Charles P. Snow has said, Scientists increasingly play a vital role in those crucial, and he means vital, secret decisions that determine whether we live or die. So those two last quotes right out of the book are just eye-opening, are they not? Hopefully your gears are turning and you're beginning to see in 2018 what is that in practice? Because there's some fairly obvious ideas I've got. Before 1939, there were clearly, quote, two societies in our civilization, as most men lived in ignorance of science, and the highly educated professors from Harvard, Oxford, and Princeton were out of touch with the major realities of the world. Quote from Quigley. Okay. At the time of World War II, science was brought into government, it was brought into war, it was brought into politics, it was brought into economics, it was brought into social responsibility. Science. See where I'm going with this technocracy theme? Okay. Quigley then mentions as an example that, quote, the almost total lack of communication, quote, between scientists and politicians during congressional committees concerned with outer space, atomic energy, medical research, you name it, uh, is was glaring. Two groups of people, scientists and politicians, talking about atomic energy per se, speaking different languages, talking past each other, not understanding each other. That's what he's saying. Snow himself, Charles P. Snow, was born in 1905 and died in 1980. He was a novelist, he was a chemist, and he also served in the UK government and the British Civil Service. He wrote a book, which was really the lecture from 1959, called The Two Cultures, and he discussed the gap between the scientists and the literary intellectuals. And so, looking at the quotes from Snow, a good many times I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of traditional culture, are thought highly educated and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I have been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? Right? Everyone's read Shakespeare. Nobody knows the second law of thermodynamics. Hmm. The next quote. I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. So you could be a Harvard professor who reads Shakespeare and have no more knowledge of the second law of thermodynamics than a Neanderthal. Just saying. Charles P. Snow. Okay. Chapter 17, page 950. The original purpose of these groups was to seek to federate the English-speaking world along the lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes and William T. Stead, and the money for the organization came originally from the Rhodes Trust. Okay, we talked about Rhodes already above, so we're not going to go through that again. But Stead was a British journalist, and he perished on the Titanic and was a publisher of the Pall Mall Gazette, and he advocated for ideas such as imperialism and unification of the English-speaking people. See the theme there? Chapter 17, page 954. I actually mentioned this, the quote, commendable from Quigley, as far as the AAE's or American Anglo Establishment's chief aims. Yeah, the chief aims of this elaborate, semi-secret organization were largely commendable. That's Quigley. And when he means the chief aims, he means three things. Coordinate international activities and outlooks of all the English-speaking world into one. Throwing a little sidebar in there, one world government, new world order, some key words there. Number two, to work to maintain the peace. I don't think he believes that based on all the military-industrial complex mess that we got, but hey, These are Quigley's words, not mine. And then 3, to help, quote, backward, colonial, and underdeveloped areas to advance towards stability, law and order, and prosperity based on Oxford and the University of London. Oh, isn't that special? Those Oxford and University of London people, they just need to diffuse their Western civilization to backward, colonial, and underdeveloped areas who don't know anything about stability, law and order, and prosperity. Am I right? Yeah, that's sarcasm if you couldn't tell because of the BS behind these jerks. Okay? I, I didn't say this. Quigley said this on page 1217, chapter 20. Corporations exist and have the earliest mark of divinity, in parentheses, immortality. Now, I don't know about you, but you don't necessarily have to be even religious to find that offensive. Corporations do not exist with the mark of divinity. I'm sorry. Quigley also says corporations exist and are, quote, refuges where individuals may function shielded from the reach of the sovereign state. When we talk about multinational corporations and private central bankers that work above nations and work in a globalist mindset, they do not like sovereignty. So corporations, which of course will have divinity and immortality, can work above the sovereignty of individuals' nation states. Troubling, I think. Page 1280, chapter 20. Both of these influences were exercised to develop, as an ultimate goal, an integrated Western Europe that would include Britain and be closely allied to North Africa. Okay? The two influences Quigley mentions or talks about are dominant American influence, complemented by NATO to give European security, right? So, through primarily strategic nuclear power, the United States and NATO had Europe's back to allow it to do what it needed to do to integrate Western Europe and, according to Quigley in 1966 when he published this, be closely allied to North Africa. I don't know. It's 2018. We got the European Union. We know that was a plot all along of the globalists and the Bilderbergers and the New World Order folk, the Anglo-American establishment types. We knew that. But it's interesting to watch what happened with Libya and Tunisia and Egypt and all these North African countries that have been, well, set off with powder kegs the last few years. Curious, right? The other influence was that European prosperity was economically economically going to be based on American aid. So we got their back with weapons. We've got them with their aid. So they're able to pursue the goals of an integrated Western Europe and a northern alliance with Northern Africa. Okay. And to summarize the core message, and at this point, I'm just looking at the ultimate goal. Okay. To summarize, or to close out the ultimate goal, I'm going to summarize the conclusion section. And the conclusion section is chapter 20, and Quigley basically goes through how he titled the book Tragedy and Hope because the tragedies clearly documented throughout, right? Death, destruction, wars, uh, but there's hope. And the way I see it, Quigley thinks that the Anglo-American establishment is the hope for the future, right? Again, their ideas and methods are commendable. Quigley's optimistic for humanity's future, and he even discusses this hope by forecasting the future and wondering about the misobservation or self-deception in his predictions. He talks about the 20th and the 19th century being utterly different, and the transition between the two is one of the most horrific periods of all humanity. He says the 19th century was a period of materialism, selfishness, false values, hypocrisy, and secret vices, and these underlying evils worked to destroy the century's hopeful qualities and became dominant in 1914. So from 1914 through 45, the real nature of the preceding generation, a nature of ignorance, complacency, and false values, were demonstrated by two world wars sandwiching a world economic depression. These are the tragedies we were talking about, and Quigley refers to as in his title of his book. So it was revealed that man couldn't control life by 19th century techniques such as laissez-faire, materialism, competition, selfishness, nationalism, violence, and imperialism. So the culmination of these characteristics of 19th century life was World War II, where tens of millions of civilians and military were killed, including in some of the most gruesome manners possible. Since war and depression are man-made and needless, there is hope, and therefore turning away from 19th century characteristics and embracing foundational Western cultural values such as generosity, compassion, cooperation, rationality, and foresight. I mean, this all sounds good, but human nature, right? Quigley additionally there needs to be an increased role in human life for love, spirituality, charity, and self-discipline. Not happening, is it? Quigley, without reservation, claims, quote, "We now know fairly well how to control the increase in population, how to produce wealth, and reduce poverty or disease. We may, in the near future, know how to postpone senility and death." I would argue that this was published in 1966, and we know how to produce wealth for certain folks, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, the owner class. We do not know how to reduce poverty or disease because those things are increasing. And I don't know, in the future, postpone senility and death. Again, he's forecasting optimistically. Quigley then goes on to state that, quote, "It certainly should be clear to those who have their eyes open that violence, extermination, and despotism do not solve problems for anyone, and that victory and conquest are delusions as long as they are merely physical and materialistic." Wow. And so, in conclusion, we don't know how to raise our children to make perfect adults, but we should know better than committing the horrors of 1914 to 1945 again and make sure to resume Western development along the old patterns of inclusive diversity. Okay, that's the conclusion of the book. So that ought to tell you, just from my perspective, what I see the ultimate goal as. Looking at the processes of how that's to take place, jumping to chapter 7, page 326. Quote, "They were determined to use the financial power of Britain and the United States to force all the major countries of the world to go on the gold standard and to operate it through central banks free from all political control, with all questions of international finance to be settled by agreements by such central banks without interference from governments." Hmm. Sounds like the TTP/IP, TTP, NAFTA, USMCA. Talked about that a few minutes ago, right? Again, corporations, refuges from national sovereignty, have the marks of divinity and immortality. Yeah. The they referenced in the quote are the folks like Montague Norman and Benjamin Strong, the again the New York Federal Reserve and the Bank of England's head, the private central bankers. These private central bankers, Norman, for example, held the governorship of the Bank of England for 24 years. According to Quigley, was very, very rare, and that allowed him to oversee the liquidation of Britain's global preeminence as the chief architect, right? Norman considered democracy and even governments a threat to private banking. So he wasn't British first per se, he was a banker per se. So if you were a banker in Asia, you were probably better off in his mind because you were a banker than his own sovereign national citizens. I'm just saying. Norman himself traveled tens of thousands of miles yearly by fast steamship under the pseudonym of Professor Skinner. All right. Benjamin Strong of the New York Fed was a devoted colleague of Norman, and he owed his position to the Morgan Bank, and especially Henry P. Davison. So there's some more names, sidebar, to do some research on. Henry P. Davison, and of course, J.P. Morgan and his bank. But Davison named Strong secretary of the Bankers Trust Company of New York, and he succeeded Thomas Lamont in 1904. Davison used Strong as an agent for the Morgan Bank in banking arrangements following the crash of 1907. Davison made him vice president of the Bankers Trust in 1909, and Strong became governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York under the joint nominee of Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb and Company in 1914. There's another company to look into, Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Strong met Norman for the first time in 1916 and made an agreement to work in cooperation for the financial practices they both revered. And by financial practices they both revered, we were just talking about a lot of that, right? Bankers rule, sovereignty, nations, forget it. And they openly stated these uh, agreements of financial practices in correspondence. So again, I think Quigley had access to their letters. I'm not for sure, I'm just presuming. Okay, moving on to another part of the process of how the ultimate goal is to be enacted. This will show you the influence. Okay, a gentleman named B. Carroll Reese, who's a representative from Tennessee, chaired a special committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations, and he issued a report, and it was very quietly issued. So let's look at why. Okay, the committee was following the money of these tax-exempt foundations, and I'm going to sidebar here real quick. By foundations, think of Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, you name it. Go look, foundations. But these foundations, these tax-exempt foundations, they started following the money. And B. Carroll Reese and his committee followed the money backwards, and from admitted communists such as Whittaker Chambers, Alger Hiss, the Carnegie Endowment, Thomas Lamont, the Morgan Bank, and into the network of interlocking tax-exempt foundations. Right. So in looking at communists, they were able to through the maze find their way into tax-exempt foundations that were influencing the United States, and were immensely wealthy people, and were running Wall Street and private central bank of New York and England. So because these people would be, I guess, embarrassed, respected newspapers closely allied with the wealthy kept it quiet so as not to affect votes or campaign contributions. How convenient. The report showed left-wing associations of interlocking tax-exempt foundations. Okay, that, again, report was issued in 1954 and was issued very quietly. The interesting piece, if you want to do some research to look at, was a guy whose name was Rene A. Wormser. He worked on the Reese Committee as the lead counsel, and he wrote a book 4 years later called Foundations, The Power and Influence. Foundations, right? Tax-exempt foundations. Don't have time to go into those, but there's a whole separate set of research around tax-exempt foundations and what they're able to get away with and why they're created. Okay? Another part of the process, the African Union and the transfer of state sovereignty. This is on page 1190 in chapter 19. Quigley goes through a description of the complex process of decolonization of Africa and the independence of the African states and the transfer of the sovereignty of those nations to those nations, and then their inclusion into the world economic system. And let's look at the independence of Ghana as an example. So Ghana was granted transition during a period of 6 years in March 1957. It was first ruled by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and within a year of independence faced post-colonialism issues such as the fall of cocoa prices, cocoa tree disease resulting in tree destruction, and civil unrest among farmers, dissension between pagan and commercial and coastal areas and the more pastoral Islamic and remote interiors. So you name it, it was happening. So Nkrumah began to handle all the problems with ruthless decision. It's a quote from Quigley. And I don't know what he means by ruthless decision, but I think you can probably go there in your mind. By 1960, the Constitution was replaced and immediately amended, allowing Nkrumah to rule without Parliament whenever necessary. Sounds like a totalitarian wet dream, right? Nkrumah's Pan-African hopes were reflected in a constitutional clause that permitted the, quote, surrender of the whole or part of the sovereignty of Ghana, unquote, to a union of African states. Sounds familiar to the European Union and consolidation of sovereignty and the one world government, doesn't it? Okay. Lastly, Quigley points out that soon political party designations were abolished in Parliament, and the Preventive Detention Act was used to arrest political opposition. Jeez, never happens, does it? Lastly, Quigley next talks about in chapter 20 on page 1207 the ideological state replacing the national state. And he does this by talking about the technological growth of weapons, transportation, communications, propaganda, and so therefore, because of that, the need for obedience is going to grow over areas that are hundreds of miles or thousands of miles or millions of miles rather than just a small concentrated area, right? Again, global, think global, one world government. In order to control, I need to have access weapon wise or transportation wise or communication wise or propaganda wise around the globe. Okay. And the greater distances required obedience over large cultural areas or groups and varying linguistic groups. Um, just pointing out some specific examples that just popped to my mind. You think of the Uyghurs in China or the Tibet in China and the way that these groups have been treated, trying to be controlled over large areas, but they're technically different areas. Sorry, China government, you're wrong. The appeal for allegiance was now becoming something required on grounds wider than nationalism. So you can see where this is going, right? The Tibetans and the Uyghurs are not nationalistic towards the Han Chinese. However, the Han Chinese who rule the country don't necessarily feel the same way, and therefore they need to rule on wider grounds than just nationalism. As opposed to if you think about the 1700s and 1800s and the way France and Germany and Europeans were fighting, you were united in your country by nationalism. So in the 30s and the 40s, we got rise to more continental blocks, and the ideological states starting to replace the national state. So you can think of maybe the Marxists in Western Europe uh, getting together across the different countries, as opposed to saying the countries themselves thinking nationally. And so Marxists thinking ideologically across Europe, you get the idea of where the ideological state's replacing the national state. And lastly, Quigley in chapter 20 on page 1287 talks about the disintegration of the sovereignty and the move to multi-level hierarchical structures. And he specifically mentions in his example the Holy Roman Empire. Again, this is the process that they want to go through in order to destroy sovereignty and have multi-level hierarchical structures. Again, technocracy, science, and very rich owner class ruling at the top and the masses below. In order to do that, they'd have organizations such as the Council of Ministers, an Executive High Commission, a Court of Justice, advisory groups such as the Monetary Committee and the Social and Economic Committee, European Investment Bank, Overseas Development Fund, European Social Fund. You see where I'm going with these just buzzwords all jumbled together? These groups, quote, have some aspects of sovereignty, unquote, as their, quote, decisions do not have to be unanimous, unquote, and are binding on the states and citizens who have not agreed to them and can be financed by taxes. Sounds a lot like the European Union right now, where some bureaucrat in Brussels decides the size of a banana that can be imported into Poland because. And you're going to pay the taxes of that guy in salary in Brussels. And he's going to dictate how big the bananas can be imported. Dumb. Okay? The supranatural, not supernatural, but supranatural national aspects of these institutions will be strengthened in the future from provisions within the treaties themselves. So the treaties themselves, think about how the TTP or TTIP or USMCA are set up, where they will create groups of the organizations that make up these countries and they get together and they make decisions and they can make their own rules and become stronger and push countries and sovereignty out of the decision-making process. And lastly, this is similar to the late medieval period. Again, Holy Roman Empire, do your research on what that looked like, but multi-level hierarchical structures of the Holy Roman Empire, a technocracy. Okay, so those are some items of the process of how it's to be enacted. And then lastly, we're going to look at the technocracy itself. And some examples of that, chapter 6, page 290. Quigley talks about French security being so dire they considered yielding sovereignty to a League of Nations or a world government. Okay, Again, this is 1918. French, they submitted a draft to the League of Nations advocating an international council to settle disputes aided by a permanent administrative committee. Disputes were to be heard by an international tribunal, and enforcement was to be directed by an international army. This was much stronger than anything the Anglo Americans were willing to propose. So the French went all out, apparently. And I think a lot of it had to do with the World War I. Okay. In 1919, the French were ready to accept the League of Nations possessing the powers of a world government, according to Quigley. At the first meeting of the League of Nations Committee at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, France advocated for a league with its own army, general staff, and its own police powers against aggressors without permission of member states. This isn't in the book, but it's a piece of pertinent news that I found of November of 2018. The Wall Street Journal article uh, talking about how French President Emmanuel Macron called for a European army. And he states that, quote, "We will not protect the Europeans unless we decide to have a true European army." Macron goes on to blame the USA, and specifically Trump, for the changes in policy between Europe and the US, and so therefore France cannot rely on the US. And both Merkel and Macron have publicly questioned America, so therefore it seems like history's repeating itself, doesn't it? All right. Chapter 16, page 837, Science is involved in government, war, politics, economics, and social responsibility. Again, definition of a technocracy. It's a form of government where decision makers are chosen for a governing office based on their technical expertise and background. Scientists. The scientists are going to program computers that make decisions on how you and your family live and die. That's the view. The technocracy is going to differ from a traditional democracy because democracy elects individuals based on skills, performance, experience, personality. Okay? Technocrats make decisions based on information derived from methodology rather than opinion. So you hear a lot about algorithms, get used to them. They're going to be ruling all decisions. Not in the book, but as a side note, there's a gentleman named Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I'm being generous by saying gentleman. He wrote a book called The Technocratic Era. This is not mentioned in the book, but it's relevant because this guy also wrote Between Two Ages. Uh, very, very pertinent and relevant to what we're talking about, but very frightening as far as what he was saying. But when he wrote Brzezinski, he wrote, quote, the technotronic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Soon it will be possible to assert almost continuous surveillance over every citizen and maintain up-to-date complete files containing even the most personal information about the citizen. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. And another quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski. In the technotronic society, the trend would seem to be towards the aggregation of the individual support of millions of uncoordinated citizens, easily within the reach of magnetic and attractive personalities, exploiting the latest communication techniques to manipulate emotions and control reason. Again, whether you like Trump or love Trump, or love or hate Trump, that seems pretty appropriate, doesn't it? Okay. Chapter 16, page 865, Man Yields Decision Making to Machines. Quigley talks about the growing complexity and the volume of the data, the increased technological efficiency of retrieving the data and the storing the data, and these things have led to a natural progression where we can have automatic decision making. So Quigley claims that the renunciation of the very faculty which gave man his success in the evolutionary struggle with other living creatures, that decision making, right? If we renounce that decision making process that got us past all the other creatures, right? If this whole process is to be abandoned in favor of some other unconscious and mechanical method of decision making, i.e., algorithms, in which the individual's flexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process, then man must yield to these forms of life, such as social insects, which has already carried this method to a high degree of perfection. So the Anglo-American establishment is looking at enabling scientific algorithms that will make decisions such that humans will do nothing more than operate like ants or bees. Does that sound extreme? I'm sorry, that's the truth of what Quigley's dictating here. Okay. Another piece of research you could look at, Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler wrote a book called Failsafe, and he talks about in the book some of these decision making machines. Okay. I threw some examples in where you think about algorithms affecting online habits of targeted advertising based on search history, right? Driverless vehicles, which are coming. Go to the grocery store. Now everything's a kiosk checkout, right? Removing people, adding machines. Talk about socialized medicine and the death panels, right? Everyone talked about Obamacare and the death panels and socialized medicine and the decision making going to algorithms. Yeah, it's in there. And then lastly, social media. That's pretty self-explanatory based on everything you've been seeing in the news from the 2016 election on. Okay, let's look at chapter 16, page 868, and we'll talk about the Stimson Doctrine and the destruction of the sovereign state. Quigley talks about U.S. Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson, who around the 1931-1932 timeframe was Secretary of State. And prior to that timeframe, states are obligated not to recognize territorial acquisitions achieved by aggressive war. However, quote, it was carried to its extreme conclusion in the American refusal to recognize Red China and shifted recognition from the objective criterion of ability to maintain order to the subjective criterion of approval of the form of government or liking of a government's domestic behavior, right? Red China takes over. We don't like Red China, so therefore we don't recognize them. They're not there. As opposed to historically in the past, if the democratic government or the monarchy succumbed to Red China and the Marxists took over, well, they maintained control and there was an order, so we don't like it, but they're sovereign, so we recognize it. That shifted with the Stimson Doctrine. That's what Quigley's talking about. So you probably need to do some research into that, historically, what it meant. But uh, another way to think of it is where in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein maintained order, quote unquote, but we decided that regime change was required. As soon as we took out the Iraqi government, disorder opened up. Okay. New states can come into being without regard to traditional realities or established procedures of international law now. Quigley talks about, quote, areas with a few states, such as Southeast Asia, were shattered into many, just because. States went out of existence or appeared, as Syria did in 1958 and 1961. This was not traditional. This is new. This is a different order. And, quote, so-called new states could come into existence by scores without reference to any traditional realities or political power or to the established procedures of international law. Okay. Chapter 20, page 1247, Quigley goes on to dispel the myth that there are actually two separate parties. Quote, the chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and international. Huh? The argument that two parties should represent opposed ideas and policies, according to Quigley, is a foolish idea acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. Again, not pointing fingers at left or right, but looking objectively. We had 9/11, Bush, Patriot Act. Everyone was upset. They were protesting in Texas at all the deaths. And as soon as he gets out of office and we go right into the next set of presidencies, we end up looking at, let's say, fast forward to Obama and Hussein's presidency, and Hussein's presidency ramped up war, ramped up Patriot Act, ramped up surveillance, but yet nobody protested because he was Obama and he wasn't Bush. So you have to remember that there's a stage, there's actors, there's there's ebbs and flows, and there's scenes on the stage where emotionally they try to draw the audience in to participate, and that's us. And we get suckered into thinking, well, I'm going to vote push out. I'm going to put in somebody better. And you do, right? No, you think you do. The same chief ultimate goals, primary objectives, strategies from a globalist, nationalist, central banker standpoint are continued. You know, you got left and right fighting over abortion, but they're still enacting a police surveillance state, right? You've got the left and right fighting over religion, or you pick the battle, but they're still both putting in the police state. Why is that? And why don't people who recognize that they're a left or a right leaning voter recognize that they're being hypocritical and recognize that? We're being played, folks. That's what Quigley's saying. Okay? Lastly, as far as this quote, Quigley goes on to talk about how we want to continue as a power, avoid high level war. And he says high level war, which is interesting. To me, what he's saying there is the low level wars are okay. You got to feed the monkey, right? The military industrial complex must be fed. Keep the economy moving. Help other countries' economies grow. Provide basic social necessities for citizens and defend basic Western values. He doesn't say defend Western values, he says defend basic Western values. So again, as long as it's within reason and we want it and we can get away with it and we're the ruling class, we're the American establishment, American Anglo establishment, yeah, we'll be able to do it. The ends justify the means. Okay? Yeah. So political parties become corrupt and inept, and then voters can change the politicians. And however, they're still going to pursue the same basic policies. Quigley puts it in quotes, writes it on paper. Lastly, page 1291, chapter 20. Quigley quote or describes quote the shift of the Western world over the last 3 decades, 30s, 40s, and 50s, from a bourgeois to a technocratic pattern was well adapted to the subterranean bureaucratic basis that had survived in France, more or less unobserved during the century in which property was obviously triumphant. So, again, written in the 60s, Quigley's perspective of France is different than France today. However, the significant point that Quigley is making is that the world is shifting into a technocratic pattern. And he points out here where France had really been able to just adapt it. And he sees that pattern applicable around the world. Okay, that wraps up the ultimate goal and the introduction to Tragedy and Hope. I hope you found something valuable in this. You've learned a lot, and I look forward to sharing more information with you.